Welcome to the Testimony Podcast here on Senetru Radio. I'm Susannah, here with Kenny.
Hi, everyone.
And today we are in chapter 4, entitled The Calling. Kenny wrote this chapter. It's really great. Just as a reminder, before we get started, you can find our book on our website, senetru.com, www.senetru, senetru.com. There's a link in the show notes, of course. And this book is available for free, a free PDF, as are all of our books. Or there's a link to purchase it from Amazon in a paperback or e-reader copy. But before we get started with this week's topic, Kenny's going to give us a quick overview of what we talked about last time with chapter 3, when we talked about the pattern.
Yeah, so last episode, we went over the pattern, and everything has been kind of everything leads up in this book. The first episode, we talked about Yahweh's pursuit of his people throughout scripture, throughout history, up to this very point in time now. And then we talked about the heart of Yahweh throughout that pursuit in chapter 2. And then chapter 3, last episode, we talked about the pattern and how surrender to Yahweh was seen through 10 different characters from biblical history, from Noah all the way up through Paul. And then we talked about Jesus as the culmination of the witness pattern throughout history and how they all were surrendered to Yahweh. They all were fully exposed before him. They allowed everything to be exposed before him. Mm-hmm. In contrast to those at Mount Sinai who said they didn't want to be exposed before him and refused the covenant. We talked about how those who were willing to be exposed were then addressed and sent. So they were given a calling that Yahweh had asked them to do. Obviously, the culmination in Christ, so that was a huge calling there, but everything was leading up to Christ and pointing to him. We also talked about something really big, which is that Christ's sacrifice on the cross is recognized both forward in time and backward in time. And Revelation says that he is the Lamb of God slain before the foundation of the world, which means that his sacrifice is recognized before the earth was even formed. Mm-hmm. So everybody who came, who was willing to surrender to Yahweh, was able to enter into covenant with Yahweh.
The same way we are today.
The same way we are today. It was no different. Now, this episode, which is the calling, we're going to talk about how that pattern that we saw in that last chapter was not just meant to be for back then. And often the institution presents the biblical figures as people who existed back then and how cool, look at what they did. Oh, David, he was a great king. He had the heart after Yahweh. Now, what does that mean for your work week? How are you going to take that into work? And that's kind of what it's left at. It's not talked about as if the heart of David, the face-to-face relationship that Moses had with Yahweh, the relationship that Abraham had with Yahweh, it's not talked about as those relationships were meant to occur with us today. We're not different. We're not. The only thing that's different is that we don't believe we're able to do it. Right. But when Yahweh calls and you surrender, you're in that same line of those who surrender, those who have faith in Yahweh. Just like Paul talks about the seed of Yahweh, those who have faith in him, surrender to him. So now we're going to go into the calling, which is going to get into exactly that and what it means to be surrendered and what was going on before. What was going on before we surrendered, what was going on after we surrender, and then also the deception that Satan, the enemy, brings in when the seed of Yahweh is planted in his children.
So, as we mentioned, the pursuit has not changed. Yahweh is still seeking those to surrender to him, but everyone's calling or everyone's assignment is going to look a little bit different for everyone, depending on where they are in the piece of the arc of time here. So like David, who was a shepherd boy until Yahweh called on him. Moses was a fugitive and a murderer who had been hiding for 40 years, and then Yahweh called on him to do something different than what he had David do. Abraham left his home without a map and a destination and did what Yahweh asked him to do and had faith that Yahweh would perform what he said he would. And he had to wait a really long time for that promise to come through, and it did. Paul, who was one of the most dramatic, I think, stories of calling and surrender, he was turned 180 degrees for what he was doing, persecuting people who followed Jesus, to turning completely around and learning from Yahweh who he really was and advocating for Jesus, advocating for the people who follow Jesus. And so everyone's call is going to look different. So it's not like we're going to have the same thing that happened to these people in scripture, but it still happens.
I think that's a really important point. It wouldn't make sense if everybody's calling was exactly the same, because you wouldn't obviously need people to be doing the exact same thing. We're going to talk about this in a little bit here in this chapter, is the deception that leads to the institution. What's important is that Yahweh gives the calling, an institution doesn't. So we want to make that very clear. But the terms of Yahweh's pursuit have not changed. The offer that he extended at Sinai has been throughout all of history. It's the same offer that came after Jesus died on the cross. But that offer was, I will be your God and you will be my people. He was offering everyone to be a nation of priests, with everyone surrendering and communing in his presence. Again, the stories in scripture are not relics of history.
No.
We know this because when Yahweh woke us up in January of 2025, he began teaching us himself. We saw what happened in scriptural history happening to us.
And while it wasn't the exact things that happened in scriptural history, there were a lot of similarities. And surrender is the through line of all of it.
Yeah, we talked about in the last chapter, undone, addressed, and right? Undone being full exposure of everything that could not remain. That happened.
And losing the persona, the identity that you built up for yourself as your identity, gone.
Yeah, we had to be willing to let it all go. Again, we didn't do it. Yahweh called us, we simply surrendered to it, and then he did the rest. He took over because we allowed him to.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that we didn't have a choice. We've mentioned this verse before from Romans, who can resist the will of God? The answer is no one. And Yahweh's will was that we would come, and he called us, and we came and surrendered. And after surrender, exposure came. He removed the things that could not remain, and then he sent us. What he sent us to do is what we're doing right now, what we're saying to you.
Mm-hmm.
This podcast, these books. This is what he's asked us to do, and so we're doing it. So when that happens with us, when it happens to you, when you're called, we all come into this being born of flesh. It's simple to understand. You're born as human flesh, right? You're conceived, your mother gives birth to you, and you become human flesh. That's a first birth. And John 3:6 says, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is spirit. We don't need scripture to tell us that we're born flesh, right? That we have flesh needs, flesh desires, all that kind of stuff. And the flesh body is the body that wants to rule self. And rightfully so. Like, you want to take care of self, right? So you want to feed yourself. You want to meet the desires that your physical flesh body has.
Mm-hmm.
So we're born of flesh, and that's all we know, right? That's all we know at this point in time, until we get into the spirit part in a second. But until we're born of spirit, we don't really know that there's another option. We might hear it in church. People may hear it in the institutional church. They may hear it said, oh, born of the spirit. But we don't really know what that actually means. The natural man doesn't understand the things. But before we go into the second birth in spirit, I want to go back to the calling part, because scripture is very clear, and this was shown in our own calling. Again, we just mentioned this a few minutes ago. Yahweh called us. We did not choose something. We did not make a decision that made us his children. We were his children. He called us into that. And when we said yes to surrendering to him, all it did was reveal who we already are.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't us making a decision, then he decided he wanted us. He already wanted us. He already knew what we were going to be. He knew we would say yes, and so he called us. John 6:37 says, "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out." This is Jesus speaking. But this verse says every single one that he calls will come. Yahweh is not calling it to uncertainty. He already knows what is inside you. This is a very difficult thing to understand. But Yahweh exists outside of time. He sees the beginning from the end. He knows what you'll say. He knows that you'll say yes. He knows that you'll respond to him. Romans 8:30 says, "Whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified." The sequence is known before it even unfolds. The calling precedes everything else in the life of the person being called. Yahweh already knows what's going to happen. It's not a question to him. He's not unsure about what your response is going to be. We've mentioned this verse quite a few times here already, but I'm going to read it again. Romans 9:19 says, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will?" The answer, again, is rhetorically, no one resists his will. No one can resist his will. When he calls, the one being called comes. Not because they have no agency, but because Yahweh knows exactly who he is calling and what that call will produce in them. To the elect, the call of their Father cannot be ignored.
And I just want to throw something in here, because Paul is the one who says this, for who has resisted his will? Again, a rhetorical question. But I've had this in the back of my mind, like if anybody was going to resist his will, it would have been Paul. Paul was doing absolutely everything, working in the opposite direction of what Yahweh actually called him into. And as soon as he was called, he turned immediately. There was no question. There was no hesitation. He didn't converse with other people. He didn't try to figure out what happened. Like, he turned immediately. I also think about this in my own life too, is like, I had let go of all of this. I didn't want anything to do with any of this stuff. I threw out my Bible. I renounced everything to do with what I thought was faith, but it was everything in the church. But that's what I had been given. But I renounced all of that. I wanted nothing to do with that. I had gone the other direction completely. And when he called, I had to surrender. There wasn't any other option. It was so immediately obvious that the way that I had been living, I could not go back to. So obvious. And so there was no other option. And so I was just thinking, like, if anybody could have resisted it, it would have been me. It would have been Paul, and probably a lot of other people whom will be called or have been called if they were going kind of the opposite direction. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it does not matter at all. Paul knew everything about what he thought God was, right? Because he knew every jot and tittle of scripture, and Yahweh just blew that out of the ballpark and was like, none of that stuff is who I really am. This is who I really am. And Paul was probably like, whoa, I cannot resist this.
Yeah.
And one thing I will note here is that, because this is what happened with me, with everyone, it might look different. We've talked about the calling, may look different. It's not coming from church. This is not where it's coming from. We're not talking about an altar call that Susannah and I responded to. We're talking about an immediate, like, over a 24-hour period, we were like, whoa, what's going on? Yahweh is calling us. It was an intense leveling of everything we thought we knew that came into us. We didn't listen to anything. We didn't read a book. We didn't hear a song. We didn't have a friend come over and talk us into something. None of that is what occurred. It was directly from Yahweh over a pretty short amount of time. One thing I will say is that there were some indicators.
Looking back.
Yeah, there were some indicators looking back. And those indicators, for me, I had this like deep longing to know what was true and a willingness to sacrifice everything I had. And I will say that I actually said those words, like, I'm willing to sacrifice everything I have, but I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but I said those words. I think I did know deep down inside what it meant, but I did not know what it meant. Like I did not know what would actually be required.
Yeah.
But again, I couldn't resist the will of Yahweh when it happened. But I think maybe some of you out there maybe listening and wondering or hearing what we're saying and saying, this sounds like something I recognize. And it might be something that you're feeling. You may feel a longing for truth that you can't explain and you can't seem to satisfy with the world. You may have a persistent awareness that there is something bigger than what the world in front of you is offering, some greater purpose, in that the pursuit of comfort, status, healing, or spiritual experience is not going to meet what you're looking for. Or for me, I had this nagging sense. I worked in social services and homeless services on front lines of that. I had this nagging sense that there was a solution to the problem that I was facing with people who did not have a place to call home. I knew there was a solution that was not within man. I knew it was going to come from somewhere else. And I gave myself over to Yahweh showing me what I was. Again, I did not know what that meant, but I knew that there was a solution, and I know that solution is coming to us. And I'll say that this nagging sense for me lasted for years.
Right.
At least. And we're going to get into this in the witness and the Gnosko knowing chapters about our own personal testimony, but probably over at least 20 years, I went to Bible college and I started questioning some of the beliefs there, and I got kicked out for questioning. Again, wait until a couple episodes from now when we talk about that. We'll go into more detail on that, but I knew there was something greater. I knew the institution watered everything down and they just asked for compliance, for ritual compliance. I always had this sense that there's something very off and there's a solution to it, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to satisfy it in so many ways.
Right.
Like we wanted to move off grid at one point in time, and I thought that was it. I mean, Yahweh had a purpose in all of it, but
of course, yes.
But I had this sense that there was something wrong and that there was something, that there was someone that could fix it. And I spent the better part of 15 to 20 years trying to find that solution in the systems of the world. And none of them worked. None of them worked. And I worked with great people.
Who really cared.
Who really cared, and they do care. They do really care. But the systems of this world are not the solution.
Yeah, they're just getting more complicated.
The more money they put into it, the worse it gets, the worse the problems are prevalent in society today. So again, we talk about our own testimony in more detail in a couple of episodes.
I knew something too on a different level because I wasn't as willing to give everything for the truth. I was searching for truth, but only if that truth would keep me as comfortable as I wanted to be. And so I've always had this nagging sense that something was off. I mean, I definitely felt it in the church. That's not a secret. I hated church and really was very repulsed by it and continue to be. But I was not as willing to give everything up for the truth as Kenny because I wanted to stay comfortable in the whole thing. So, but I did have this knowing that there's no way that the way that things are can keep going like this. And that was years ago, and they have escalated to a level that is way beyond what I thought then. And it's still, I still feel the same way. It just cannot keep going on this way. So we both knew Kenny definitely had more of a willingness to actually look it in the eye than I did. I wasn't willing to look it in the eye. I was a little more standoffish than he was. But again, when we were called, we couldn't say.
I think there was a moment in time where we had a friend over and we were talking, and I think I said something to the effect of, there's something here, and I don't know, does it require that we give up everything? And I think that really freaked Susannah out. I think she knew what was coming at that point in time.
I did.
I didn't quite know, but I knew that it was like I had something on the tip of my tongue that I couldn't quite explain yet. So at some point in this sort of process where I begin to get this thing on the tip of my tongue and Susannah has some sort of knowing, we have the calling actually takes place and the seed is planted. That's how we refer to it. The seed is the logos of Yahweh. It's his will and intent implanted into his children. So the seed, again, is the logos of God. This is not information about him. We did not receive, as I mentioned before, we did not receive some sermon. We did not have a friend meet with us and convince us to accept the Lord. It was nothing like that. It was all of a sudden the living will and intent of God was within us, and it was like driving out everything that could not remain there. And it was painful. Yeah. Very painful. 1 Peter 1:23 says, having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible, through the living and abiding logos of God. So the corruptible seed is the flesh. It's corruptible because it's going to die. Mm-hmm. Our flesh is going to end. It does not reside forever. The incorruptible seed is the logos. That's the logos of God. That's his will and intent. So that will and intent becomes planted into us. And this is where the second birth has occurred. So we have the first birth of the flesh, and then at some point in time, we have the plantation of the logos, the seed, the living will and intent of Yahweh is planted into us, and we are born again. This is what Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus about in John 3:5-6, when he says, when Jesus answered and says, most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Again, the first birth is the flesh, the second birth is the birth of the Spirit, and it is not something that you decide you're going to do. A baby does not decide when they're going to be born or how they're going to be born. It happens. It just happens. John 3:8, right after this, says, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. This takes all human ability to decide out of the picture. Mm-hmm. The Spirit of God plants the logos of Yahweh into those he's calling. You don't choose that. Yahweh chooses it. The Greek word for spirit is pneuma and carries the meaning of wind and spirit simultaneously. And this verse in John 3:8 that talks about the wind blowing where it wishes is pretty obvious here. You can't command the wind. You cannot produce it. You can't schedule it. You can't direct it. You only respond when it comes. Being born of the Spirit has the same character. Again, Yahweh's initiative and not ours. Now, this is the moment, again, where everything begins to change. For us, it was painful. We knew what was happening. Some ways, Yahweh was helping us through this process. This is what Hebrews 10 speaks about. I will put my laws in their mind and write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So his law begins to be written within. His will and intent is written within our hearts. At this point in time, when we are born of the Spirit, we shift in our orientation. Mm-hmm. We start being driven upwards toward our heavenly Father. We are now moving towards him, being pulled upward in his direction instead of downward towards the needs of our flesh. So this does not mean that you do not have flesh needs. It means that your flesh needs are not the driving factor behind your life. It means that not everything you do is driven by your flesh. You still are going to need to eat. Yeah. Suzanne and I were talking about this today, but we have noticed that Yahweh is speaking to us, not from reading the Bible, from his logos being implanted into us and him speaking to us. That is food to us, to our spirit. If we're not getting that, things become difficult. And food itself can become like we're disenamored with it sometimes.
Yeah, it doesn't fill the same void that it used to. It doesn't have the same hit that it used to have.
It's not the driving force behind your decision making. I did this yesterday. I'm like, I need
to hear something.
To hear from Yahweh. And he spoke to me, interestingly, in a dream. And in the dream, I received food
Yeah.
in the spirit, in the dream. And I knew what it was. Like I knew what he was giving me. Romans 8:5-6 says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace." So Paul is not describing here two different categories of people who have made different philosophical choices. He is describing two different operating platforms. The person governed by flesh is pulled by flesh towards self-rule and all of its expressions. The person born of the Spirit is pulled by the Spirit upward toward Yahweh, toward alignment with his will and intent. This is not done by striving or self-discipline. It is not white-knuckled effort. It is a seed growing in the direction of its source. It is naturally occurring.
Mm-hmm.
When you are surrendered to him, it's occurring naturally. The best way that I can describe this is to say that before the birth of the Spirit, I was pushing, trying to make things happen.
Yes.
Everything required effort, my own steam, my own management of outcomes, all directed toward the end goal of fulfilling my own desires. But when the effort stopped, so did the movement. After surrender, something else started moving. The effort is different now. It is the effort of remaining yielded, which is really its own kind of difficulty because we want to do.
We want to make things happen.
We want to make things happen. That's pushing. We want to push. But in this situation, we are not generating the movement. We're yielding to Yahweh. Galatians 5:16 says, "Walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh." The instruction here is not fight harder against the flesh, not try and not do the things that it is asking of you. It is to walk in the Spirit. If you walk in the Spirit, you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. We keep moving in the direction the Spirit is pulling. That is the operating platform of everyone born of the Spirit of God. Not pushed downward by striving, pulled upward by the Father.
So we've mentioned this before, but this does involve a lot of waiting.
Yeah.
To be pulled. Waiting for his desires to drop in, basically. It's how I experience it, is I'm not making decisions for myself. I'm not making a schedule or a plan or anything. I'm waiting for his desires to drop in, and then I move. The other thing that I want to say that we've noticed, is that we used to live to fulfill our flesh's desires all the time with food or hit of something, like ways to feed that craving of, like, spending money, drinking, whatever, using those outside hits to fulfill our flesh's unease. And those things don't work anymore.
Which really leads to the clever deception is what we call it. And we go into this in greater detail in a chapter later on called the defacement, which goes into the enemy's structure. But it's really important for people to know about this because the flesh is facilitated by the institutional church and its rituals, its ritual observance. We'll get into that. But it's very important to know about this because when the logos of Yahweh, the seed, is planted in his children, the enemy is paying attention. He sees that occurring. And right after that logos is implanted, the enemy tries to come in behind and plant, we'll call it tares. That's what we're going to get into here in a second. He comes in behind and tries to get those who are being pulled upward by the Spirit. He tries to get them being pulled back down into the flesh. And it's a very, very clever deception. We've talked about this verse many times, but Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." What I want to identify here is a covenant-specific form that opposition takes with people who have had Yahweh's logos planted in them. It doesn't look like obvious darkness. So
For the pull us to the bars.
right, this is where it gets really, really clever.
Right.
It does not present itself as temptation towards things that are obviously destructive. That would be too easy. I'm going to ask people to really take a step back, because we're talking about an enemy that is incredibly clever.
Yes.
Incredibly clever.
And very persistent.
Will use all different kinds of tactics on you. Implanted thoughts, dreams, everything that you hear is not from Yahweh.
Emotions,
feelings,
yes.
all of that type of stuff. The enemy uses those things. He does not use blatant evil to try to deceive the people most likely to be Yahweh's true children. He uses deception that talks, acts, and looks like the right door while leading somewhere else entirely. Paul addresses this in Galatians. The Galatian people had been turning away from the spirit back to the flesh. These are people who already have the seed, the logos, implanted in them. So they're already God's children, but the enemy has come in behind and planted in lies to deceive them. Galatians 1:6-7 says, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. And then a few chapters later in Galatians 3, Paul says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Are you so foolish? Having begun in the spirit, are you now being made perfect by the flesh? Now, what is very important to hear and see here is Paul is talking to them about a religious ritual, circumcision. There are people within the group of believers at the time that are trying to convince the Galatians that in order to become perfected in the spirit, they need to do ritual flesh activities.
Mm-hmm.
Circumcision is literally getting your flesh cut, but it's a literal flesh activity. It's a ritual. And again, as we mentioned, what is alarming here is Paul's not warning them about drinking alcohol or sexual immorality or idolatry. He's warning them about religious ritual. Now, this is going to be difficult for many people to swallow, but attending church, reading the Bible, reciting verses from memory, water baptism, tithing, communion, ritual communion, they are all physical acts of the flesh. It's not because any of these things are necessarily evil, but it's because they have become the mechanism through which people believe that they are pursuing their relationship with Yahweh. These actions of the flesh point back downward to the flesh, away from the spirit. They are attempts to be made perfect by flesh, just like Paul warned the Galatians about. This is the deception, and it is precisely targeted. After someone is born of spirit, after the logos is planted and the upward pull begins, the enemy does not offer obvious destruction. He offers religion, ritual, and performance. He offers a door that has Yahweh's name on it that does not lead to Yahweh. He channels the hunger of those being called into a system that consumes that hunger without ever actually feeding it. And the leaders of that system tell you that all the rituals and all the performances are actually what walking in the Spirit is. That is a lie. Both Susannah and I have lived this. We were embedded in it. We performed the rituals. We read our Bibles. We attended church. We memorized the verses. We baptized our children. You name it, we probably have done it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was all empty ritual that led away from life. We could feel it. We just couldn't really name it.
Right.
Now we can. We cannot emphasize this enough. The greatest deceptions are targeted specifically at those most likely to be Yahweh's true children. The ones who feel the pull, the ones who genuinely hunger for something real. Those are the ones led into systems that look like life but only produce death. Again, the enemy is far more clever than anyone truly realizes, and the most successful deceptions look almost indistinguishable to the eye of the flesh.
I just want to reiterate that these things, these actions in the flesh, are all doing. They make people feel like they're moving in the right direction because they're doing something. They're proving their devotion or their intention. They want to make it look to themselves and to God that they're sincere and they're searching and wanting the truth. Again, this is where that waiting comes in. And when he does call, instead of pushing towards the church, which is a very logical reaction, is to go to where they say that they can interpret God for you. It's that waiting for his direction that it's excruciating, because you really want to do something. We, as flesh beings, we really want to do something. But that's that difference, is waiting for his direction and for him to show you what he wants, for his desires to drop in, and not be pushing towards actions that are, again, ritualistic. And I know the church says that they aren't, but they certainly are.
Yeah, the institution, they didn't do it maliciously, but the enemy used their desires to serve him. And people are drawn into the institution. Many people who are genuinely called by Yahweh have the institution as the first place that they go to.
They get sucked in.
And they get sucked into it because they haven't developed discernment at this point in time. And this is where the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13, it's also in Luke as well, but Matthew 13, 24 and 25 says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way." Now, the man who sowed the good seed is Jesus. And the seed is the Logos. That's in Luke 8:11. It clarifies the good seed is the Logos. While men slept is this time when discernment hasn't been built up and developed yet. His enemy is the devil, Satan, obviously. And the tares are lies that are sowed among wheat, which is the truth. The soil of the field is the hearts and minds of those being called. Christ plants his Father's will and intent into the surrendered life, and the enemy moves behind, as we've discussed, into that same ground. And he plants those lies that you need to perform. Susannah mentioned devotion. People literally do devotions that are trying to demonstrate their devotion to Yahweh, right? You're either his child or you're not. That's what it comes down to. And you don't make yourself his child by your devotions.
No.
You surrender to him, and his will and intent is built into you. What's really interesting about the wheat and the tare story is that tares, or they're also called darnel, they're a ryegrass that is biologically indistinguishable from wheat through its entire growth phase until the grain head forms. It grows at the same rate, reaches the same height, and carries the same exact appearance as wheat. But here is what makes a prime difference between wheat and tares. Tares are poisonous. They carry a toxin that, when consumed, produces confusion, dizziness, and stupor. Tares do not simply fail to nourish. They impair the person eating it, producing the appearance of being fed while actively working against them. Tares are the enemy's counter logos. It's an opposing logos. It does not just fail to produce what Yahweh's logos produces. It mimics the appearance of spiritual nourishment while delivering something that clouds discernment, produces a kind of spiritual stupor, and leaves those consuming it convinced they are growing when they are slowly being poisoned, all while looking identical to the real thing. Tares are lies that look so much like the truth that they are indistinguishable without the Spirit. The tares are planted again while men slept, before discernment has formed, before the logos has grown long enough for the difference to be made visible. The enemy is already working at this time. This is the mechanism that Paul saw operating in Galatia. The Logos, the truth, was genuinely growing in them. The tares, religious performance. With the Galatians, it was ritual circumcision. It was flesh dressed as spiritual completion. They were growing right alongside the truth, consuming the same soil, wearing the same appearance. Paul could see that fruit forming. The Galatians could not, because they were still in the growth phase where both looked the same and the contamination had not yet shown what it was. Just like the Galatians, today the enemy has come in behind the planting of the Logos of God and has planted lies. Lies that drive away from the Spirit and toward the flesh, driving downward towards the flesh. For the Galatians, again, it was circumcision. For the people today, it is church attendance, scripture reading and memorization, devotions, tithing, water baptism, ritual communion, and the belief that a man, a pastor, a priest, a biblical scholar, or a theologian is your avenue to know and understand Yahweh.
So I just want to add to this because I see two different things happening here. The first thing I see is that the Logos is planted, someone is genuinely called by Yahweh, and they go the direction of the church, because that does make sense in that place.
It's what everybody knows.
It's what everybody knows.
Satan set it up that way.
He's real smart. So that person goes to the place that claims to, again, interpret God to you. So you get stuck in that ritual performance. Either you're doing that and you continue to do that and you continue to believe the lie and you continue to just double down on those things, or at some point you realize it's crap and you leave and you renounce all of it, which is what I did.
I mean, we know lots of people.
Yeah. It kind of one of two ways here, and the enemy wins both ways.
Right.
He's either deceiving you into believing a lie, or he's deceiving you into believing the whole thing is nothing to begin with. And so either way he wins. And again, we continue to say that he is incredibly smart. We've had a lot of experience with him over the last year and a half, and it never fails to surprise us how smart he is. And he will not stop any form of deception. So when the Logos is planted and there is the call, the genuine call from Yahweh, which again, I think has happened to a lot of people who have gone to the institution, and it either, turns into what the institution turns it into, or it fizzles out eventually into like, this is all a lie because it doesn't do anything. But the institution does not want you to know is that you don't need it. The institution itself is a tear. It itself is one of the lies. And it makes sense because when we are called, we want to know. I mean, especially me, I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to understand everything all at one time. I wanted to know how things worked. I wanted to know who God was. If he wasn't who the institution taught me who was he? I wanted to know all of it immediately. So it makes sense that we would go to a church or a teacher to try to learn more and know more. And again, I have a ton of understanding around this because I am one of those types of people that just wants to know everything right now. And again, this is where the waiting comes in. And this was taught to us slowly and painfully over the last year and a half. And we certainly didn't know that to begin with, especially me. I think Kenny probably had a much more, a patient outlook towards it where I really wanted to know everything. I'm always that way. But the waiting and the waiting for him to teach us and the waiting for him to build trust in us has taken a year and a half, and we're still in the teaching process, of course. It doesn't come quickly, but that institution will fulfill your need to, you can sign up for classes and get discipleship and listen to the pastor's sermons for the last however many years, like in quick succession, and fill your mind with knowledge about their version of God. But the only way to truly know him is to wait for him to teach you. and it doesn't come quickly, generally. I mean, it can. Probably did for Kenny a lot more. It can come quickly. It doesn't come on our schedule. It doesn't come with our effort. And he knows what we can handle and how to measure out what he gives us. And he gives it to us in these measured amounts, what we can handle at a time, especially if this is all new and it's all, for us, it was very different than what we had grown up with. And it was, something I had completely renounced. And so I couldn't have learned everything all at once. We couldn't have learned everything all at once. So we have to sit back and wait for him to teach us instead of pursuing that knowledge.
And going to him and just saying, I want to ginosko know you more. We're going to talk about this in the very last chapter, ginosko knowing, but we talked about Hosea last week. Hosea was given this charge to marry a prostitute who would be unfaithful to him. In that process, Hosea came to know Yahweh and Yahweh's pain and heartache and the churning in his stomach over his people being unfaithful to him. That was knowing that was implanted into Hosea through experience that you cannot know by reading a book.
Or hearing a sermon.
Right? So that's the type of teaching that we're talking about. You go to Yahweh and you talk to him. Ask him to teach you, right? Hebrews 8:11 says, and this is speaking about what happens when the covenant becomes you, when you are living the covenant, when the Logos has been implanted into you, and you are living under the order of Yahweh. None of them shall teach his neighbor, none his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. This is Yahweh speaking. He's not describing a system in which a trained and credentialed professional mediates access to him for people too unqualified to approach him directly. He is describing the inverse of that, a covenant in which his people know him firsthand. From the least to the greatest is what that says. There is no partiality, no institution authorized to stand between a surrendered person and the direct relationship Yahweh is extending. And the Greek word in there, so we have know the Lord is in that verse. The Greek word, which we're going to go over many times in this podcast, in this book, is ginosko. That's the original word that's used for know. And it is not intellectual knowledge. It is the same type of knowing that describes the most intimate human bond, experiential, personal, and direct. It's what I just mentioned what Hosea was given with Yahweh. This is before Hosea there was no Bible for Hosea to read. There was a Torah, but there was no full Bible for Hosea to read. When you go to the Father, you are going to the Spirit. When you go to the institution and its performance and rituals, you are going to the flesh.
I'm just going to interject here real quick because I just noticed something in this that is another huge deception. When Kenny just said, Yahweh's not describing a system in which a trained and credentialed professional needs to mediate access to him. And I know we've mentioned this a couple of different ways, but I'm just thinking this is another huge piece of the deception, is that this giant congregation of people that are sitting in a church are too unqualified to approach Yahweh directly. They need a man to stand in between them and God. That is one of the biggest deceptions here, is it keeps us powerless. It keeps us believing that we must keep going to a educated person who went to seminary, who learned about God, to tell us about him, instead of having this understanding that we have the ability to have the same relationship with Yahweh that Moses had, that Paul had, that all of these people we mentioned in the last podcast that were surrendered fully. We have the same ability to have that same relationship with Yahweh. And the church teaches us that we must go to them so they can explain him to us.
Yeah, the institution trains you to need it. It positions itself as the interpreter, the explainer, the authority through which you are permitted to understand what Yahweh is saying. And what's really interesting about this, Susannah, is that this is the same exact move that the Levitical system made at Mount Sinai. They stepped into the space between Yahweh and his people that the people created when they said, don't let God speak to us, let Moses speak to us. Again, Moses didn't comply with that request. Moses returned to the mountain, pleaded for Yahweh to forgive the people. But the people did not want what Yahweh offered. They wanted a human mediator.
Mm-hmm.
That is what you do when you're going to the institution, is you're requesting to not have direct access to Yahweh. You have been given direct access to him. A nation of priests, all of us with one-on-one relationship, face to face, like Moses, speaking to Yahweh like a friend, the heart that seeks after Yahweh like David. Aaron filled the role in the case of Mount Sinai. So Aaron stepped in when the people wanted a human mediator, and Aaron said, I'll do it. He made them a calf to worship and eventually established an entire works-based system of flesh-filled activities. The institution has been standing in that space ever since that time, maintaining a gap that the true covenant was specifically designed to close. When Yahweh woke Susannah and I up, the first thing that he did was he began teaching us. He told us, no commentaries, no books, just come to me and I will teach you. Through his Spirit, he would teach us. And that's what you all are being called to. When the Logos is planted, you are called to go to the Father through Christ, fully surrendering to the will of Yahweh, and he will teach you. He moves you when you need to move, and you do not need to perform your way into his presence because the seed has been planted, and he is already pulling you toward him. So the verse that this chapter is hinged on is John 4:23 and 24. And that says, but the hour is coming, now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So Jesus said these words to a Samaritan woman at a well, someone who was completely outside the religious establishment entirely. That was purposeful. And he told her plainly that the hour is coming, but now is. Not after you qualify, not after you find the right institutional structure or building, now. Worship in spirit and truth is not a religious practice. It is not a style of music or a format of service or a frequency of attendance, and it's not singing words of music at a stage. It is not something you go to or an activity you perform on a schedule. It is a life fully surrendered to the will and intent of Yahweh. In spirit means not through physical ritual or external performance. The Logos planted within you, reaching back towards its source. The Spirit in you, responding to the Spirit of Yahweh. This is not something you do with your body on a schedule. It is what happens from the inside when the governing authority has actually changed. In truth means not toward a constructed version of him, not towards a version that has been structured through the doctrines of men, through statements of beliefs, not toward the picture the institution handed you or the bearded man on the ceiling or the false Jesus who endorses the building and the program, toward who he actually is, as he has been revealing himself through his Spirit since the moment the seed was planted. Together, spirit and truth mean real contact with the real Yahweh. Nothing performing, nothing constructed between you and him. The Logos in you turn toward the one that it came from. This is the operating mode of a life that has been surrendered to Yahweh. The worship is your life.
So I'm going to reiterate the patiently waiting again, just because it is a huge strategy of the enemy to make you want to act urgently. One of his biggest tools is to impart this sense of urgency into us. And when we are surrendered to Yahweh, we are waiting on him, and we are letting his desires become our desires. One of the hardest things I've had to learn, that Kenny's been really good at helping me remember, is that Yahweh doesn't impart a sense of urgency to us. That is purely from the enemy. And I know the past year and a half, I have felt senses of urgency many, many times and have had to really give that to Yahweh every single time because I want to do something so badly. I want to change something, fix something, explain myself, reach out, do things in the flesh to try to appease how I feel, this sense of unease. And there's this sense of urgency that is very strong. It has been, like I said, a really persistent tool that the enemy uses to try to make us act in our flesh, to try to pull us back into self-rule and away from leaning on Yahweh to perform what he says he will. And a couple examples of that is for David. Yahweh anointed David as king, and then there were, I don't know how many years exactly. Many years in between when he was anointed king and when he actually became king. And during that time, he was hiding for his life, a lot of it, because Saul was after him. And it wasn't like a pleasant, happy time for him, I'm sure. It was probably very tumultuous. He probably had this sense of urgency around it, like, Yahweh anointed me. Like, why is this not happening? But he had to continuously, and you can see through what he wrote in the Psalms, continuously give everything to Yahweh and let him take it. One of our favorite Psalms, Psalm 27:14, it says, "Wait on Yahweh, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on Yahweh." That
Says it twice.
I repeat that to myself a lot because we're waiting on some things that we've been told, asked nicely to wait on, and we've been promised things that are not on our timeline, and there's nothing that we can do about it, and we have to continuously wait on Yahweh. Another example is Abraham and Sarah. When Yahweh promised them this child, it was 25 years between when he told them and when the child was actually born, and they were very old at the time. They were already really old at the time, but he promised the child, and then by the time the child was born, they were really, really old. And so there was, I'm sure, a huge sense of urgency, which is why they attempted to make it happen on their own. But the enemy uses this sense of urgency to get us to distrust Yahweh, to take things into our own hands, to get us acting back in the flesh, to pull us back into self-rule. That is where he wants us all the time. He does not want us to depend on Yahweh or lean on him or trust him for anything. He wants us depending on ourselves, pulling ourselves back into the steerer of the ship. So again, just want to reiterate that there's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of non-urgency. There's no emergency here. Yahweh will direct you. Kenny has told me this over and over again. He will literally make your body move to do the thing that he's asking you to do when it's time to do it. He's not just going to hope it happens. He will direct you to do it. And he has directed us. And the waiting has gotten easier.
That we've talked about many times. Our desires change. He gives us desires for things to do that they would not necessarily normally come because that's driven by him.
Right.
There's no pushing to change the minds of people. There's no conversion tactics going on here. We're speaking what we're given, and we wait for him to teach. We get into a bad circumstance if we try and, Susannah mentioned earlier, we want to understand everything like right now.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get into the place where we're impatient or urgent, and the enemy puts anxiety into your body to try and push you. But if you get into this place where you're anxious or urgent, it's a good time for deception because you want it.
You want answers. The enemy will give you answers.
You will get answers when you desire them, and you've got to really make sure that the Spirit is pulling you upward towards him by you seeking him. And when you seek him, he will give you everything that you need. You must trust him fully to give you all that you need to know. Every move you need to make, every word you need to speak, he's going to direct you, and he's going to pull you up toward him as long as you wait patiently on him.
He moves, he teaches, he directs, he builds. he restores. Our job is to keep the yield position, to remain surrendered, and to let the Logos operate as the governing authority of our lives, and to let the Spirit pull rather than the flesh push. To worship in spirit and truth, not as a service we attend or a performance we deliver, but as the actual condition of our lives. This is what the calling produces, not a religious person with better theology, not a performer with a more convincing act. A surrendered life with a new governing authority, a planted Logos, and a Father who moves when it's time to move.
So that is the calling. Next episode, we're going to go into, and I'm excited about this chapter. It's called The Cost. Susannah wrote this chapter because we talked about like setting the record straight.
Mm-hmm.
And this chapter sets the record straight on something that has been really misstated and misdirected by the institution. There's a lot of salvation is a free gift notion that takes the surrender piece off of people. And we're going to talk about that on the next episode. We're going to talk about Jesus's own words spoken into that and what he says about forsaking all.
And what it really means.
What it really means.
Instead of just a nice thing to say.
Yeah.
So there's a deeper meaning to a lot of it it costs.
Yeah, because salvation, while the gift is freely given, the acceptance of that gift requires everything. Everything.
Yeah.
Because you have to give up everything that you think you are and hold and surrender it all to Yahweh. So that's what we're going to go over in the next episode on The Cost. We want to thank you again for joining us on the Testimony podcast here on Senetru Radio. Again, go to our website, senetru.com, get access to the free PDF of this book, or you can go to our Amazon page where you can order the book in a paperback or e-reader version. Other than that, thanks for joining us, and we will talk with you next time.
Bye.
Bye.